nonprofits and the people behind them. Casey Cares is that intersection of the nonprofit and profit communities, making Kansas City a better place to live, work, and play. This Casey Cares segment is brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation, www.kaufman.org. I'm Ruth Baum-Biggis. Leadership is the ability of an individual or a group of people to influence and guide followers or members of an organization, society, or team. Well, that sounds so simple, yet there are so many things involved with leadership. On this Ask the Expert episode, we're exploring the concept involving leadership that may be new to some of us. It's called followership. Here to explore followership is someone who has been studying it for some time. We welcome Elizabeth Ireland, who is the Director of Training at the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership at the Henry W. Block School of Business at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Elizabeth recently presented a session on this topic as part of the center's leadership conference. Well, welcome, Elizabeth. I feel we're ready to dive into followership.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited.
All right, we got to start at a base, right? So what is followership? And when did this term arise?
Yeah, so I think it's really a good spot to start at defining how we generally think about followership or how it's been relayed to us in the literature. And so there tend to be two different camps that followership falls into. And the first is a role-based, and that one emerged first. And then the second one is this social process camp. And so role-based really is this idea that individuals enact their followership based on having a formal or even an informal role or position. In this case, we talk about organizations, but it could really be in various different aspects of their social life. The other side is the social process camp, and that says that it's socially constructed and that it's more relational between leaders and followers. And there tends to be a little bit more flexibility in who is considered the leader and who is considered the follower, and they're able to kind of switch back and forth based on the context.
How did this science? This new area of thought under the umbrella of leadership even come into being? How did folks just kind of dive into this?
Yeah, because we're so heavily focused on leadership all the time. That's a really great question. So as you know, for much of leadership studies, it's really been focused on the leader themselves, right? Their traits, their behaviors, their characteristics. Are they charismatic? Are they intelligent? Are they tall? Believe it or not, that was one. But then as it shifted forward, there was always some conversation of followers inside the literature. Though they were regarded differently depending on the perspective. So somewhere around the mid-'80s, towards the end of the '80s, Robert Kelly put out an article called In Praise of Followers in the Harvard Business Review. And that really sparked this emergence of followership and talking about what it means to be a follower and what it means to be an effective follower inside organizations, and really began to say, hey, we have been thinking about followers our leaders for way too long. And it's time that we actually start giving some attention to followers and giving them the credit that they deserve, because more often than not, we're going to serve in a follower role rather than in a leadership role. And so we really do need to focus on followers. It's also a role-based approach, his model. And then moving forward into about the mid-'90s, Ira Chaleff said, hey, this is a really great idea. And he kind of built that out a little further, though he looks at it slightly different. He looks at whether or not followers are supportive of leaders and of their organizations, but also this idea that they need to be really courageous, which means they need to stand up for their leaders, but they also need to be able to stand up to their leaders. If we move a little bit forward, we have Barbara Kellerman in 2008, and she actually kind of says, hey, let's pare this way back and just look at one dimension of being a follower. And so she looks at just that engagement piece. And she says that, followers really are individuals that don't necessarily have power or influence, though they may have some degree of authority. Beyond that, we start shifting into those more social process perspectives, which says, this really is a process where leaders and followers are agreeing to be that identity, right? In some instances, I'm a leader, and in some instances, I'm a follower. And if I choose to be a follower, then that means I'm granting you the ability to be the leader. And we have this more co-constructed or co-produced look at what it means to be a leader and what it means to be a follower.
That's a lot to unpack.
It is.
Where do we start? So I like that you had mentioned, I think sometimes people feel if I'm a follower, the chiefs, the Indians, and the Indians are just slogging through the mud, carrying the packages while the leader is upfront, charismatic.
Yeah.
But as you describe this, the follower really has a very important role to play in organizations. Let's talk about that a little bit. What are those characteristics, or what are those commonalities that followers should have to be good followers, I guess?
That's a really great place to start. So I tend to, when I'm explaining this or I'm talking to individuals for the first time, because first off, most people are like, what is followership and why are we talking about followers? I tend to have them start with those role-based approaches, and Robert Kelly's is usually the first one I introduce, just because it is familiar. Whether or not we've realize it, we understand what these follower types are because we've seen them in organizations, we've seen them in our social lives, we've seen them on movies and TV, right? So they are kind of familiar to us. And so he looks at followership in terms of whether or not there is engagement and whether or not there's critical thinking. And so to Robert Kelly, he says that really effective followers, which is what we should all strive to be, are individuals who are able to manage themselves well. So they're able to do their work with a high degree of autonomy. And in fact, they absolutely need that in order to do their best work. They're also individuals that have really high standards. And so they're not necessarily looking to get the job done quickly with a lower quality product. So they're going to really have those high standards and strive to do the absolute best for the organization. They are also individuals who are purpose-driven, and so they, have this strong need to have to support someone other than themselves, which makes it a really natural fit for the nonprofit context because, we all seem to be purpose-driven in this work, and so it's just a really good connector because we're already kind of bought into that piece initially. Individuals who are effective followers also really work on building their confidence. So they're going to be those lifetime learners. If they don't know something, they're going to go out and be self-motivated and want to learn it because, again, they have really high standards and they want to do what's best for the organization. And they're also going to focus their efforts for maximum impact, which means that they know what their strengths are and they play to their strengths. Although there are certainly opportunities to grow in the areas that we're less strong in, they know how to make the most impact inside their organizations. And then finally, they are individuals that are courageous, right? So they're willing to stand up to their leader when they need to. And we use leader loosely there, right? So it could be in all kinds of different individuals, especially in the nonprofit context. They're also really honest, right? So they're going to be authentic and they're going to kind of tell you like it is, although they're definitely tactful. And because they are honest and because they are authentic, they are viewed as being more credible. And so they tend to be experts inside their organizations or inside their field.
Can you be a bad follower?
Yeah, you could definitely be a bad follower. And that kind of brings us into this idea of, how do we think about ourselves as a follower? How do we think of others as followers? And these ideas and sort of conceptions of what it means to be a follower are things that we've started early in our life and we've kind of just built them as we've gone on, and now we're bringing them into our organizations. So for some, being a bad follower means that they're really passive. So they're not engaged in the work. They just come in, they do the bare minimum, and, they get their paycheck, and they're just really not looking to make any waves, but they're also not making any great impact because, again, they're very passive. Others might be alienated followers. And so the interesting piece there is that you could actually be a really effective follower, but if there's a misfit or a misalignment between leaders and followers. And that could also include how leaders think individuals should follow, because for some leaders, they have this more hierarchical view. And so they think that you should be passive, right? You should be obedient. And we definitely don't want that inside organizations, because that's not how we grow and thrive. So if you were an effective follower, if there's that misfit, you might actually slip into being alienated, which just means that you're really critical of the leader, but it also means that you're more likely to look at, looking for another job. And so that turnover intention grows within you. But there are also just individuals that refuse to follow. And that's just kind of their conception of it. And they just want to be a leader. And so they will not follow anyone. So yes, there are bad followers. But I hope with more education and more intentionality behind strengthening who we are as followers, but also as leaders, strengthening who others are as followers and letting them have more leadership opportunities, we can kind of help resolve some of that.
I remember sitting in your presentation, which was so interesting, and such a diverse group of people in the room. So when we did group work, it was interesting. You could kind of tell what kinds of organizations and what role people played, and if it was working well in terms of leaders and followers. At any rate, how much does personality and who you are play into what kind of a follower you may be?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. So it's kind of a multi-pronged approach, right? So we need to understand what is our quote unquote native follower style, although, it's a spectrum and we shift in and out, but we also have to compare that with, are we an introvert? Are we an extrovert? Also, what are those implicit feelings that we have towards leadership and who leaders should be and what makes a good leader? All of that, our willingness to speak up, but also providing opportunities for people to speak up, it all plays a part into creating more effective followers. But personality is definitely an aspect to it, just as it is with leadership.
Okay, you get that Debbie Downer or David Downer in there. Is there a way to, as the leader, let's say, work with those followers to raise up and try to mitigate maybe how they learn to be a follower?
Yes, and they need a lot of support from you as a leader. They also need a lot of peer modeling. And so for some, they may have that perspective because they've had other leaders in the past that have said, you need to be obedient and you need to be passive, because that's the conception that they had. And so you may actually just need to show them a different way. But it does take a lot of time, because you're going to have to build that trust first to create that safe space for them to be able to challenge, or to even get them engaged enough to the point where they're wanting to take on more challenging tasks and kind of grow that sense of autonomy. So yes, you can improve them. It just takes a lot of work, but there are also other perspectives that look at it that are kind of more from that engagement piece. And they say, this is how you more strategically move individuals along that follower spectrum. And a lot of that means you got to get them bought into the purpose of the organization. You got to build those relationships among peers, and then also with the leaders, and just model the way for them so that they know that they can kind of grow in this way, and hopefully it improves. Although, again, there are some of those individuals that are just never going to follow. And so we don't always need people to challenge. Sometimes we just need people to come in and do the work. And so that's fine. When they get more disruptive, or they're constantly challenging a leader, or they're really confrontational, that's where you kind of have to start working those more performance management pieces to either help them get them on board or get them to a different opportunity, if you will.
You mentioned a big 5-letter word, I think, trust.
Yeah.
Sounds like that is absolutely key in being a follower and being the leader. In being a follower, is trust something that can be challenged or inspired, perhaps, so that you play the game, as it were?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you can definitely look at it from a few perspectives. So first off, trust underpins everything that we do inside organizations. So individuals, so followers, if you will, who trust their leader are going to have higher performance. They're going to have less turnover intent. They're going to have greater satisfaction and commitment to the organization. So there's all of these really great benefits that come from building trust. But if you are an effective follower and you're willing to challenge a leader, and you have a leader who maybe is less than ethical, or maybe you see that the organization is going in a direction that they shouldn't go in, and the leader shuts you down on that, that is going to erode your sense of trust. That might actually propel you from going from effectiveness, like being an effective follower, to being an alienated follower. And then you're going to start again looking at that turnover intent, or having a higher sense of burnout, whereas you had that drive to kind of push through. Now things are you're feeling the effects of it more because the relationship between the leader and you is strained.
You've been studying this a while. And when you look at leadership, do leaders need to have been followers?
Yes, absolutely. The best leaders are individuals who are really effective followers. And it's funny because if you look at the different traits and characteristics and behaviors of followers, they mirror that of leadership. It's just that you look at it from more of a partnership perspective, or like we're working together. And in this instance, I'm the leader. And in that instance, I'm the follower. Instead of this like command and control style that says, I'm always the leader, you need to be passive and obedient, and just be a yes person and do your job. And so, yes, the really great leaders are also really great followers.
We had a colleague of yours on the show a few months ago, Tom Van Sage, talking about founder syndrome. So I'm wondering, in that founder syndrome, do they have a missing gap of followership where maybe they've never been the follower? They've always been the leader.
Yeah. And then, it's very complicated issue there. There's a lot of emotions and feelings around that. But if they are the type of leader that doesn't like, again, to be challenged, right? That sort of wants to have everything rubber stamped by the board or rubber stamped by the staff, they're going to be really used to that. And that's going to be hard to let go and to kind of look at leadership from a different perspective and kind of say, hey, I'm going to bring this person on in order to have a succession plan, but really we're going to be partners. Letting go of that leadership piece, if that's a really strong piece of their identity, is going to be really hard for them.
You mentioned a few moments ago, too, another word that kind of stuck out with me that's partnership. Is that key to be a good follower in the whole dynamic, of an organization?
Yeah, I would say that there's a time and place, right? There's a context and situation for both leading and following, but that the most effective forms tend to be those that are more of a partnership, where they're treated more, not necessarily as equals, right? They're supervisors and they're quote unquote subordinates, even though we don't love that word, right? We just want to call them followers. So there is a hierarchy there, but from that social process angle, they're partners, right? They're creating leadership and followership together because it's what's in the best interest of the organization. And, it helps them achieve their mission in a more effective way.
We're talking with Elizabeth Ireland. She's the Associate Director of Training at the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership, and she is the guru on followership. Are organizations talking about this? Is this something now that nonprofits, when they, take time to look at how they're run, are folks talking about this, and are they embracing it?
I think that they are talking about issues related to followership and followers, though they may not be looking at it from an academic followership lens, right? They may not actually know that's what they're doing, but they're certainly talking about the issues at hand. One of the things that we need to do a little bit better as an academic community is include followership in with our leadership coursework. I have been through more leadership classes than I can count, and I think I only heard the word followership once in all of that time, although I certainly use that for all of my projects and every speech I did in class. But within organizations, we just need to start talking about it a little bit more, in particular with the nonprofit organization and nonprofit sector. So in general, followership lags leadership studies, right? If we go to Barnes and Noble or another bookstore, we're going to see far more books on leadership than we are on followership. And if we could look even, we kind of, select out even more and look at just the nonprofit sector, we're going to find far less information out there about what it means to be an effective follower inside nonprofit organizations, which is the reason why I'm specifically looking at that with my dissertation, because there's a need to have a sense of what it means to be a follower and what followership looks like, and all of those behaviors, expressions, and characteristics, but that's grounded inside the unique context of nonprofit organizations.
It would seem to me if you don't have followers, then you're not going to move the needle forward towards your mission. And I know that sounds very basic, and I think there's something unique I'd love to hear you address is a nonprofit hopefully has staff or whatever, followers that are part of it, but then you have volunteers and you're driven by boards. So how does followership play into that? And how do you infiltrate in a good sense to get those folks on board?
Yeah, so it's not actually that basic of a place to start, because while we tend to think that we've fixed some of those issues with, command and control and authoritative leadership, right? They pop up in organizations of all types and of all sizes, because, we're just humans and we bring with us what we think of leadership should look like. In terms of looking at specifically like segmenting out what it looks like with your staff, again, you could start with Robert Kelly, Ira Chalip, and just kind of look through and assess what kinds of followers you have amongst your staff. How do they naturally lean? What do they think of being a follower? You could just ask them, what does it mean to be a leader and what does it mean to be a follower? And that gives you a really good idea at how they approach leadership and how they approach followership. But when we look at, how we have relationships with board members, there really is a need to have that sense of shared leadership. And so for that, we really need to lean in heavily towards those social process approaches that says, we're in this together. And again, we're claiming the role of, or the identity of leader, or we're claiming the role of our identity of follower. And we're, working together towards that common purpose or that common goal. If we look at volunteer management, we may not need our volunteers to do a ton of critical thinking. We may not need them to challenge leadership or, challenge others inside the organization. We may just need them to show up and, be engaged in the work that we do and be, a supportive element inside our organizations. And so for that, I tend to recommend individuals look towards Barbara Kellerman's model of followership, so that they can just look at that engagement piece, right? How do we move people from that very beginning, like I'm not even necessarily familiar with the organization, right, to where they're an activist or a diehard for the organization, although diehards can kind of go either way, right? They could be really positive for your organization, or they could just, they could be yes people because they're so bought into it that they can't necessarily see the impact of what they're doing if it's not necessarily ethical or, beneficial to the organization.
How do you keep followers from that tipping point, as you mentioned, being so gung-ho that they think they can run it all? And I guess sabotage leadership, that's a pretty hard word, but how do you navigate? What does it say in the literature and academic circles?
I think it's more of like the gut level of what you do there. And it's you got to look at them as a human being and just say, what are the quality of interactions that I'm having with this person, right? Do I have positive interactions, or are they always or mostly negative interactions? How do I build the relationship again? So they have to be really mindful and intentional of how they respond to you as a leader and how supportive they are of you. But it also means that you may need to think about what your own conceptualization of followers are, because if you're having a lot of individuals that are, pushing back constantly, it may be that you have a different view of what followers should be than what they do. And so the more we can educate individuals on, first off, what followership is and all of the different types and models and ways in which you can use it to your benefit, the more we're able to say, have those tools and resources that we need when we have individuals that we may need to move, advance them in that followership spectrum so that they're more effective for the organization. But it's also knowing that if we've gotten to the point where we've tried all of these things and we've tried to build that relationship and it's just not working, how do we leverage those performance management tools, or how do we encourage them to maybe find something that's more fulfilling for them so that they're less likely to be alienated.
Or be a roadblock, or any number of things that can cause trouble. In your studies, have you seen, is corporate America embracing this versus nonprofit? Is it about the same that everybody's getting to this is worth looking at?
Yeah, I would say that they've probably been using followership and just the different models more heavily in corporate America, just because they tend to also embrace those leadership models a little quicker, right? There's more literature about them. If you go and look at the academic literature, there's far more out there about, corporate leadership and corporate followership. Although I will say that followership in general has been looked at within military because of that, position and rank, and everyone kind of knows what that looks like. But there's also that need to be somewhat obedient because you need to follow orders, but then also having the ability to know, hey, we're going in a wrong direction and I need to speak up now. It also tends to be looked at, followership does, in areas where there are a higher percentage of female staff members or female workers. And so you'll see a lot of research out there about nurses, which also kind of speaks to this, there are leaders, right? Or there are those that consider themselves leaders in that environment. But really the work is done by nurses, and they are actually enacting both leadership and followership in their work. And then it's also looked at a lot in academic institutions, in particular in higher education. Although we're starting to see it kind of trickle down into, K through 12 and also pre-K. There's a strong need for it to be there. But again, there's a definite need for it to be explored more inside nonprofit organizations because we have so much a greater need for shared leadership. And so we really do need to look at how do we embrace followers and how do we strengthen them so that we can leverage the most from our individuals so we can achieve our missions.
Elizabeth, this has been fascinating. Followership. She's provided us with some great resources. So dig into this. It's something that's really important for organizations. And let's let the nonprofit sector be the leader, right? And then follow the great things that you can do as a follower. So thank you again.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I have enjoyed this.
Thank you for joining us for KC Cares. We're Kansas City's nonprofit voice, and we're produced by Charitable Communications, also a nonprofit. This KC Cares segment was brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, www.kauffman.org. If you'd like to be a guest on KC Cares or Underwriting Opportunities, go to our website, kccaresonline.org, and spread the love. You'll find us on Facebook and Twitter at KC Cares Radio, and on Instagram at KC Cares Online. And don't forget, you can catch us Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. on ESPN 1510 a.m. and 94.5 FM. Thanks for joining us on KC Cares.